bachelor's from the School of Engineering in 1930, and became actively interested as his career progressed in the philosophy of mind, and indeed published a monograph on the topic entitled Consciousness, Matter, and Energy, The Emergence of Mind and Nature by Benjamin Pinkel. And I'm pleased that I have this copy here to give to our speaker.
Thank you.
The objective of the monograph was a re-examination of the mind-body problem in light of new scientific information, and the lecture series was endowed in honor by Sheila Pinkel in honor of her parents to continue and keep us updated on the new scientific information and new ways of thinking about the mind, the brain, and related topics. So with that introduction to the series, I'll turn the proceedings over to Lisa, who will introduce today's distinguished 19th annual Pinkel lecturer.
Hi, thanks. So it's my absolute pleasure to introduce Ned Block today. Ned Block is the Silver Professor of Philosophy, Psychology, and Neuroscience at NYU. I had the pleasure of learning from him while I was doing a postdoc at NYU not too long ago. He came to NYU in 1996 from MIT, where he was the chair of the philosophy program. He works in foundations of perception and cognitive science and neuroscience. He's one of the most influential philosophers of mind and cognitive science in recent history, so we're super lucky to have him here today. Among his many accomplishments are the following. He's the fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a fellow of the Cognitive Science Society. He's been a Guggenheim Fellow, a senior fellow of the Center for the Study of Language and Information, a Sloan Foundation Fellow, a faculty member at 2 National Endowment for the Humanities Summer Institutes and 2 summer seminars, the recipient of fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the American Council of Learned Societies, and the National Science Foundation. He's also a recipient of the Robert A. Mew Alumni Award in Humanities and Social Science from MIT, and the John Nicode Prize École Normale Supérieure, Paris. He's a past president of the Society for Philosophy and Psychology, and a past chair of the MIT Press Cognitive Science Board, and past president of the Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness. The Philosopher's Annual selected his papers as one of the 10 best in, get this, 1983, 1990, 1995, 2002, and 2010. He's a co-editor of The Nature of Consciousness, Philosophical Debates, MIT Press. The first 2 volumes of his collected papers, Functionalism, Consciousness, and Representation, came out in 2007. And he's currently writing a book on the perception-cognition border titled A Joint in Nature Between Cognition and Perception. The talk that we're about to hear is based on some ideas from this forthcoming book. So without further ado, Professor Ned Block.
Okay, can you hear me? Yes. Okay, so I know that there's a competing philosophy talk, so I'll pause maybe at 3:15. People can who are going to go off to that can go off. So the way I'd like to run talks is people should feel free to ask questions at any time, especially informational questions or comments. If the answers would be too long or take us off in a direction that I think wouldn't be good to go, I'll suggest that we postpone them for the end. Okay, so the topic is why there's a joint in nature between perception and cognition, even though the effects of cognition on perception are commonplace. For those of you who know the lingo here, perception is not informationally encapsulated, but there's still a joint in nature. So let me just introduce so that's sometimes called cognitive penetration of perception. So a joint without, while allowing cognitive penetration of perception by cognition. Okay, so just to give you the intuitive idea of the issues, we look at a blue thing, we think it looks blue, we think a cluster of dots looks like many dots. A face looks like a face. And then there are these things that look expensive, a diamond watch, a fur coat, a piano looks like a piano. But which of these looks are genuinely perceptual as opposed to a matter of perceptual judgment? What's the difference, and how could we tell? So those are some of the questions I'll be addressing. I'm going to use the term perceptual judgment so that it is an aspect of the mind called cognition, which is concerned with thought and reasoning rather than perception. I'm also going to be distinguishing between low-level perceptions of shape, color, texture, brightness, motion, and things like that, from and those can be defined as the products of sensory transduction that are causally involved in the production of other visual representations, like maybe as of a face. And I'm going to be distinguishing those from high-level perception, things like many dots, the perception of something as a face, and as far as the perception of something as expensive or as a piano, I don't think there is such a perception. I think what's going on there is we perceive low-level properties and we make a perceptual judgment that those things are expensive or are piano-like. So I can introduce some of the issues with a little video, which I will show you part of. So I'm going to skip the slower. Let me ask you, you saw a 6 in there. What was it? A 6 of what? What?
Red spade.
He thinks a red spade. What do you think? Anybody have a different view?
Heart.
Red, okay, 6 of hearts. Anybody have a different view? Okay, so here's the thing. Some people think you had an experience of a 6 of hearts. Other people think your actual experience was of this, which was what was really on the screen. And then there was a post-perceptual judgment that it was the 6 of hearts. So I'm glad that we had both. So my orientation on this is that we have a perceptual experience of what was actually on the screen. I mean, I'm not particularly talking about this experiment, but generally. This is an example of an experiment done in the 1940s, the Brunner-Postman experiment, and exemplified what was called then the new look in perception, which was the idea that your expectations, your thoughts, your wishes had a strong effect on your perception. This gave rise to a movement in philosophy and in history. Perhaps the two most well-known exponents were Thomas Kuhn and Norwood Russell Hansen. Kuhn went to the extreme of thinking that people with different theoretical perspectives actually lived in different worlds, is the way he put it. Then there was a counter-revolution in the 70s and 80s. Maybe perhaps the founding document is Jerry Fodor's modularity of mind, but also some papers by Zenon Pilyushin. They, or I think it's Pilyushin actually, coined the term cognitive penetration. And they argued that there was no cognitive penetration of perception by cognition, where cognitive penetration is defined not just as any old top-down effect, but as one that is, in Pilyushin's word, is sensitive in a semantically coherent way to the organism's goals and beliefs. And probably the main empirical idea that they used was, at least with respect to vision, was this idea that illusions, like for example, those yellow lines are actually, those yellow bars are actually the same length, but the top one looks longer. And even when you know that the top one and that the two are the same length, still the top one looks longer. And so they took this as exemplifying failure of cognition to penetrate perception. So I'm going to be kind of assuming Tyler Burge's framework, and Tyler is here in the audience, and he can answer any questions you have about it. So in which the idea is there's a strict separation between the non-conceptual and conceptual aspects of the mind. Perception is non-conceptual. Tyler likes the idea that you can think of it in terms of an analogy to a linguistic expression, although he's not saying that perception is linguistic. And the idea is that there's a singular element and a general element, the singular element indicated by the that, and the general element indicated by the F. So you single out something, perception, a thing, a space, an instantiation of a property, and apply a predicative element of perception to it. Whereas in the case of cognition, cognition is conceptual and propositional. A basic perceptual judgment would be that is read. So here, concepts are, in my terminology, are taken to be constituents, or paradigmatically constituents of cognitive states. So there's a familiar ambiguity in the term concept between a meaning-like entity where words in different languages for the same thing all express the same concept, and a mental representation sense in which those can be different concepts, different concepts of dog, say in this case with different causal roles. Just to make ideas clearer, there's this famous statement that is probably now used more as kind of a little injection of humor by Bruno Latour, who claimed that Ramses II could not have died of tuberculosis because it wasn't discovered until thousands of years later. So, and he actually said, and this is a quote, "Before Koch, the bacillus had no real existence. To say that Ramses II died of tuberculosis is as absurd as saying that he died of machine gun fire." So what is this confusion here? It's the confusion between the concept of tuberculosis in the sense of a mental representation, which came into existence in 1882 with tuberculosis itself. So I think the border between perception and cognition is this border. So I am going to start with some basic perceptual phenomena that can be used to test whether a representation is perceptual or cognitive. And I'll start with something called adaptation. Now, notice that these will have more to do with the function of perception than with its most fundamental properties. The most fundamental properties, according to me, are the non-conceptual, iconic, and non-propositional, and quasi-modularity of perception. But these methods are ones that that will help us with seeing which things are perceptions. So adaptation is something that seems to have been known to Aristotle, who said when persons turn away from looking at objects in motion, especially, if, for example, rivers, and especially those which flow very rapidly, things really at rest are seen as moving. That's what's now known as the waterfall illusion. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you to stare at that plus. And let's see, I'm going to dim the lights a bit here. So you have to stare at it for, let's say, 30 seconds. So don't look away, just stare at the plus. And then I'm going to ask you to get ready and pay attention to what you see. I don't wait a full 30 seconds. Okay, so in a few seconds, so I'm ready. So when I say go, pay close attention. Ready, set, go. Anybody want to say what you saw? So, somebody want to say what you saw? Yeah?
I saw a color image and then
Yeah, okay, so it was a black and white image, but it looked colored for a while because the original one you adapted to, you have these red, green, and yellow, blue channels in the visual system, and the when you saw, for example, the red here, or the reddish here, your red-green channel fatigued, as people say, the red receptors balancing them towards the green, and then when you looked at that, it looked more greenish. Now, that is a low-level perceptual effect, but also there are high-level perceptual effects. And here is an example. I want you to stare at that. And then I'm going to show you another picture, and I want you to tell me whether it looks more masculine or more feminine. And you have to say the word masculine or feminine immediately. You can't wait. Okay, so I'm going to say 1, 2, 3, go, and you have to say the word masculine or feminine. This works best if you wait like 45 seconds, but I'm not going to do it. Okay, so I'm going to say 1, 2, 3, go, and you have to say the words masculine or feminine immediately, depending on just your impulse of the moment. Okay, 1, 2, 3, go. Okay, now stare at this for 30 seconds. Okay, so now I'm going to do the same thing again. You have to say the words masculine or feminine. 1, 2, 3, go. Okay, so what you saw was the same thing twice. The first time, so it's a morph. So this is more masculine, this one is more feminine, this one is a morph of the two. When you stared at this one, fatigue in your facial masculinity receptors, and this looked feminine. When you saw this one, it looked masculine. Okay, so that suggests that you have something in the visual system is sensitive to those stereotypical gender looks. And I'm going to do one last one. This is a little different, so fixate that. And then I'm going to show you another display. And what I want to ask you to do is to say the word right or the word left, depending on whether it looks like there's more on the right or more on the left. Okay, remember, you're going to say either the words left or right, depending on whether it looks like there's more on the left or more on the right. 1, 2, 3, go. Right. Okay, now look again. Okay, so what you should see is that those are exactly the same. So why did it look like there were more on the right? Because you have numerosity, approximate numerosity channels in the visual system. The channels for, on the left for high numerosity were, quote, fatigued. The low numerosity were fatigued. And so when you looked at this thing, there was a preponderance of low here and a preponderance of high here. So it looked like there was more here. Now, let's try to draw some conclusions. Is adaptation, so clearly there's perceptual adaptation, but is it only perceptual? It certainly does affect how the stimulus looks, but it's not completely conclusive since the phenomenology could attach to perceptual judgment. Now, here is an additional factor, which is adaptation is often, maybe even always, either retinotopic or spatiotopic, that is dependent on which part of the retina it's projected to, or at least which part of space. And that appears to depend on retinotopic or spatiotopic visual areas. So that suggests that that retinopathy or spatiotopy does suggest it's visual. Of course, how do we know which areas are the visual areas? This brings in a kind of circularity that's a problem, and I'll try to say something about how to cope with that, because you have to identify the areas that are themselves visual areas. Now, stimuli can be of different cognitive categories, but treated equivalently by the visual system, and conversely. I probably won't get to explain that particular diagram. But most importantly, adaptation gives the same classification as other paradigmatic perceptual phenomena, and it's that conjoint pointing to the same phenomena as perceptual and the same ones as cognitive that I think is the key to the circularity problem. Okay, so I'll say a little bit about high-level versus low-level perception. So, you saw adaptation to a feature of a face. That could be a high-level property of being that feature of a face, or to low-level properties such as color, shape, texture, including generic shape properties, as Tyler has emphasized. And this gives rise to a recognitional coextension problem, which is, how can we tell whether our perceptual representation is for faces as opposed to clusters of recognitionally coextensive low-level perceptual representations? Well, we can get some help from the brain areas involved, whether they're low-level or high-level brain areas, but of course those themselves need to be calibrated in some way. I think it's another, what we need here is different sources of evidence that all point in the same direction. Now here is one really cool item of evidence that suggests that the numerosity adaptation you saw is genuinely a high-level perceptual property. And this is some work done by Burr's lab. What he did was let's look at the left one. That may be, we'll start with the one on the left. He had people tap with their fingers, either slow tapping or fast tapping. And he looked at the effect of those taps on their visual judgments. And in particular, he contrasted judgments of numerosity for flashes and for simultaneous presence of dots, like the ones you just saw. And what he found was that if they adapted to taps, if they adapted to slow taps, that's the upper line here, the upside down triangles, then their flash judgments were higher. They perceived something as more numerous than it was, and opposite for adapting to fast taps. And these are all in the same hemifield, but if they were in different hemifields, there was no effect, or little or no effect. These are the filled in, the not filled in figures here this is a graph of numerosity versus perceived numerosity. And a very similar curve for simultaneous dots. So here's the argument. The argument is a scientific simplicity argument that says that uniformity of effect should be ascribed to uniformity of cause. And so it looks like the uniformity of cause is simply numerosity of temporally extended or simultaneous. And this is cross-format, cross-modal. It's spatiotopic. The fact that you didn't get non-spatiotopic adaptation suggests that it's not cognitive, it is genuinely perceptual. Because why should the cognitive system care about whether it's on the right or on the left? Adaptation is necessary for perception, but it's probably not sufficient because some cognitive states can involve perceptual materials like imagery, mental maps, perceptual memory, perceptual anticipation, as Tyler has pointed out. So I think adaptation is sufficient for perception or perceptual materials. Okay, so that's adaptation. I'm now going to move to rivalry. You can get rivalry in monocular rivalry, where it works with one eye, like this familiar Necker cube, where first one face pops out, then another. But you can also have binocular rivalry. So, for example, if you have red and green glasses on, as illustrated here, and you look at a superimposed, if you look at red and green face and house and face rather, your percept will be fill your whole visual field, move from face to house to face. The explanation of rivalry is there's always a dominant percept in perception, except with brief periods of instability. It's a winner-take-all system. Then what happens is the winning stimulus is weakened by adaptation, and so the prior losing stimulus then wins, and then it starts over. So this is this provides an argument that rivalry is perceptual rather than cognitive, because cognition is not a winner-take-all faculty. We're willing to entertain mixtures. We have stable entertainment of mixtures. And also, the cognitive oscillation we have is not inevitable. So compare, those of you who are philosophers will be familiar with these trolley problems, or the famous disputes about whether the twin Earth stuff in the twin oceans, which has a different chemical formula from water, is really water, or whether it's some other substance. You may switch back and forth in those cases, but it's not inevitable, whereas it is inevitable for these bistable figures. Your perception will switch back and forth. You can control it somewhat by attention, but you can't control it completely. It will switch. It's inevitable that it switches, and that difference between the inevitable switches for perception and the non-inevitable switches for cognition gives you an index of whether something is perception or due to perception or cognition. Another perceptual phenomenon is pop-out. So you have pop-out in visual search. The red thing is much easier to find on the left, where it's very different from the other things. And here we have some curves where the distractors are very different. You get somewhat independent of distractor set size. This is a reaction time measure. And I especially like this because this is, sorry, I forgot to say that it's perceptual similarity in fact, visual similarity that's involved here. And of course, that raises the circularity problem again. What's a visual similarity? I particularly like this because it's in pigeons. You could guess that maybe since pigeons' perceptual capacities are very highly developed, but maybe their cognitive capacities aren't. It gives you more reason to think it's perceptual. We have pop-out for faces. How many see the face here? Yeah. So that's another indication that faces, that there's something, there's a high-level visual representation of faces. Another factor is interpolation. So you see, there's no triangle on the screen, but you see a triangle. It occurs in many organisms that may not even have cognition, and it happens faster than thought. So the beginning of it happens at a little over, somewhere maybe 60 milliseconds. These so-called amodal figures happen. So of course, this raises the question of how we know how fast thought is as compared with perception and which organisms have thought. It's the circularity problem. Now, I think the solution to the circularity problem is that the deliverances of these different tests give you the same results. Adaptation, rivalry, pop-out, very fast processing, occurs across the phylogenetic scale in creatures that perceive, and the general method is we find tests that group together that apply to cases we're sure are perceptual and don't apply to cases we're sure are cognitive, and that seems to work. And so I think that gets rid of this circularity problem. So how do we know that these things don't work with conceptual representations? I have to concede that we don't really know that they don't, but we have some reason to think that they don't. Just the lack of experimental evidence of phenomena that fit these signature properties is reason to think for cognition that they don't work with cognition. We have an evolutionary reason. Perception is focused on news, whereas our slow conceptual systems are not. A news-oriented system has reason to filter out things that aren't news, which is what's happening, one way to describe what's happening in these adaptation phenomena. We, at least in vision, we have this winner-take-all principle, which doesn't seem to apply to cognition, as I mentioned earlier. Yes, so there we are. I am going to move ahead here to methods of distinguishing cognition from perception. So I'll give you one illustration of a method. This is a fairly well-known paradigm for illustrating bias that has been alleged to have a big effect on perception. Now, I'm not saying it's been, I will give you evidence that it's not perceptual, but I'm not saying this evidence is definitive because there's evidence that points in the other direction. I'm not going to give you a balanced treatment. So this method, pioneered by Keith Payne, is you have a prime, a black face or a white face, and then you have either a tool or a gun, and then you have a noise mask. And I'll just mention one experiment which I particularly like. So in this experiment, the target objects, the tool or the gun, were presented at barely perceptual duration that was calibrated separately to be 65% accurate for each individual subject. There was no response deadline. There were both target trials and blank trials. And here's the key thing, that after each response, subjects were asked to give one of these three responses. The C response, they were confident in their answer and they saw perceptual detail. And examples of perceptual detail were given, like the color of the stock of the gun, the shape of the wrench. That was one alternative, C. Another alternative was no. They know the response is correct, but no perceptual detail. And the third was guess. And here's the result of this. These are errors, proportion errors. And the dark blue is stereotype congruent, light blue is stereotype incongruent. And so this is the one for which the biased responses come out. And it's no versus C or guess, suggesting that when people were making the biased judgments, it might have been a perceptual judgment without a perception, because when they said they could see details, there was, in this case here, there was no bias. So this is, I'm not trying to settle, as I said, I'm not trying to settle this issue. I'm just trying to give you a feel for how you can tell the difference between something being genuinely perceptual as opposed to a feature of perceptual judgment, a kind of cognition. Okay, so those are the methods. Now I'm going to move on to what perception is. So these methods that I've suggested They work for a variety of reasons, but I think probably have more to do with the function of perception than with its more fundamental nature. So the fundamental nature, I think, is this iconic, non-conceptual, non-propositional idea that I've been mentioning. And there's also, I think, a limited architectural idea. So first of all, perception is non-propositional. So perceptual representations don't have the logical role of propositional representations. One cannot see something as if red, then blue. What would that be like? One can see something as non-blue by seeing it as red, but one cannot see something simply as not blue. One can see something as intermediate or indeterminate between red and blue, like, for example, purple, but not as having the disjunctive property of simply being red or simply being blue. So these, indeterminate or intermediate have different accuracy conditions than the disjunctive property of simply being red or being blue. So that's the non-propositional. Non-conceptual, I'm going to give you an argument in a minute, but I'm not there yet, that will argue that 4 to 6 month old infants have color percepts without color concepts, and that provides an argument that their color perception is non-conceptual. Now, that doesn't show that all perception is non-conceptual, but it does put the burden of proof in the court of the conceptualist about perception to provide some reason for thinking that perception is conceptual. So it's just an initial move in a dialectic, although I have to say I have not been impressed by any evidence I've ever seen that anybody who holds that perception is conceptual as given. I think the lead reason many philosophers hold that perception is conceptual is because they think it's better for epistemology. You can just, you get they think, a better idea of how to justify your perceptual beliefs on the basis of perception if you think we just believe what we see. But I think that the epistemology of perception should be based on the actual facts of perception rather than made-up facts that make justification seem easier than it is. That is all put very tendentiously, but okay, so that's perception is non-conceptual, and I'm going to get to that. Perception is iconic. Well, I'll just give you one item of evidence. This is a form that has been explored by Lisa Feigenson in an experiment where babies were given little boxes with that they could reach into but not be able to see what was in the box. And then in one experiment, they were given pieces of graham cracker, were put in these two boxes, and the result is that babies crawled towards the box that had the most graham cracker. They were able to sum over the pieces of graham cracker going to the one with the most cracker stuff in them, which suggests that the representations are ones that allow summation, that magnitudes are represented by magnitudes, and that is an indication that the representations are iconic. So iconic representations are often said to be ambiguous. Wittgenstein's famous example of someone, a picture of a man walking down a hill could also be a man walking up a hill backwards. However, there's plenty of evidence that still pictures are not interpreted by the visual system as ambiguous. So Nancy Kanwisher, for example, showed that people who see still pictures of people doing some sports thing showed motion after effects consistent with the sports. So for this reason, Fodor argued that that imagistic mental representations have to be images with a caption. But I think this is a mistake, because I think as long as we have the right functional role of these imagistic representations, we don't need the caption. And you may wonder why we need the iconic representations. Well, for things like these. So anyway, the idea is that perception is iconic. That is an aspect of format. It's non-conceptual, non-propositional. That's sort of like content. Maybe it mixes a little bit of format and content because if you have a functional role theory of what it is to be conceptual and propositional, you might think it somehow involves both format and content. And it's quasi-modular. I hope I will get to that later. So I think modularity in the extreme form of Pelitian and Fodor is wrong, but there's some of it that survives. Okay, so let me now move to categorical perception. I can see I'm not going to get through this talk, but I'll just stop at 3 wherever I am. Okay, so these are continuously varying rainbow, wavelengths, but our visual system imposes categories. They look like bands of color. And infants show categorical perception of color before they have conceptual abilities, and I won't go through that. But let me just give you an idea of how we know that infants, that 4 to 6 month old infants have almost adult level color perception and also what color categorization is. Okay, so this is work by Anna Franklin. So if you show an infant an expanse with a disk of a different color, if the infant can see the difference, the infant tends to move its eyes to the disk. And if those are in different categories, the infant moves his eyes faster. And this paradigm can be used to tell what the visual capacities are and what their categories are. Another method for categorization is this habituation method, where you show the babies purple, 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 and then there'll be an odd one out, and depending on if the baby recovers interest and looks at the screen instead of at its feet, that is an indication of a different color category. So here is a way of illustrating infant color categories. You can see there's the cases where there's no line is a category boundary. So infants regard this and this as in different color categories, but not this and this, or this and this, and to some extent not these two, and that extends over to here. So their categories are different from ours, but also somewhat overlap. And here's some different languages where the stars are boundaries that correspond to the baby boundaries. So in some languages, there are very few of those boundaries. So the infant color categories correspond not all that well with adult color categories. So I think that the categories of perception are often conflated with concepts. So that's one reason why I like this categorization stuff. And we have a lot of perceptual categories, including for causation, for example, or the look of causation. Here is the reason why I think that how we can see that infants have color perception and color categories without color concepts, is they don't have the abilities that are indicative of concepts. Those abilities are revealed in perception of conception of shape, size, and kind, but not of color. The focus here is on working memory representations, which we have reason to think are conceptual and cognitive. We have reason to think that we need working memory to do reasoning. So if we have a statement of the form P and another one of the form P if P then Q, we need to store those in working memory in order to deduce Q. So reasoning seems to require working memory. Working memory is a cognitive capacity. I won't go into some of this stuff since I'm running out of time. So here is one of the experiments that suggests that that babies, even as late as 12 months, but certainly 6 months, cannot reason with colors. So you show a baby a screen, something of one color comes out one side, another color comes out the other side, and they don't expect two things, even at 12 months. Whereas they have, remind you, they have near adult levels of color vision at 4 to 6 months. And that suggests color experience can be non-conceptual. Here's another paradigm. In a control, you have one shape come out, another shape come out, and then there are things of both shapes when the screen goes up. But here is an experimental procedure where one shape comes out, another shape comes out, and then there are things that are not of different shapes. And the question is whether they're surprised at this. The answer is they're surprised by a difference a difference in shape from what they saw, but not by a difference in color. And here's another indication. There's many experiments of this sort. So this is Jean-Remy Hochman showed that children, so they have a twirling frog that babies like. And the question is, if trained, same shape means twirling frog on the left, could babies learn that rule and look to the left? Answer is yes. What about same color means twirling shape on the right? Could they learn that? Well, when you did that on same color and same shape, they learned, even at 12 months, they learned same shape but did not learn same color. So if babies between 4 to 6 months and a year old have color concepts, they are not exhibiting them on any test that anybody has done that I know of. So that is reason to think they don't have color concepts. Furthermore, on average, children know 4 basic color words by 3 years, 3 months. Mabel Rice did an experiment where she took a group of 2 to 3-year-olds who knew no color words and taught them the difference between red and green. For most children in this sample, learning that difference took over 1,000 trials over several weeks. So children are extremely resistant to learning color language. Once they learn one color word, they learn lots of color words right away. Here's a little anecdotal thing that I'll just tell you. What it says is, this is Charles Darwin saying he thought his children were colorblind because they were so stupid color-wise. So here's a summary of the evidence that I presented. Infants can see colors at 4 to 6 months at nearly adult level, and they have perceptual categories for colors. They can use shape, size, and kind information in forming expectation and as inputs to rules at least 6 months earlier than they can use color information. 2 years later, most children do not know the basic color words, and many children don't seem to know what adults are talking about when they talk about color. Substantial reasoning with color seems to happen at the same time as learning color words. So this suggests that they have color perception without color concepts. Is all perception non-conceptual? Well, the conceptualists have some work to do. That's the conclusion. Now, let me move to cognitive penetration. Okay, so are there direct content-specific effects of the content of cognition on the content of perception? I'll first mention a mental imagery experiment that suggests that we can superimpose mental images on percepts. And the reason for doing this is it's a demonstration experiment, but I think a lot of the results in perception that reflect top-down effects are actually effects of this sort, where what we're getting is not pure perception, but imagery superimposed on percepts. Okay, so here, if we are shown a matrix of dots with a missing dot, it's easy to move the cursor to the missing dot. So in the procedure that I'm going to be using or describing, you have two 12-dot partial grids separated by an stimulus interval in the same spot. And then the subject's task is to say where the missing dot is. So I'll give you an example of what they look like. So you see there was a first grid and then a second grid separated by half a second. Here's a 2-second delay. So you can see how hard this is. So here's a diagram of the data for this. So this is percent dots remembered versus interstimulus interval up to 5 seconds. So the top line, it represents number of dots remembered in the grid that's on the screen. Remember, one grid comes up, disappears, and then there's a grid on the screen, and you count as less than 100% up here if you actually move your cursor to where there's a dot on the screen now. Okay, so very few people do that, so that's at 100%. This line represents your accuracy for the first grid that is gone. And what you can see is that after about 5 seconds, after about 1.5 seconds, they're very accurate on that, up in the 90%. So people are able to create an image of the first partial grid and superimpose it on the second. And interestingly, it takes a while for them to do that. So you can see the little dots right here indicating that if the two partial grids are close together enough in time so you can fuse them, you can be very accurate. But then after a few hundred milliseconds, your accuracy drops precipitously and then climbs again after about 1 second to 1.5 seconds. And interestingly, that 1 second to 1.5 seconds is a time that has been shown by Steve Coughlin to be how long it takes to generate a mental image. People appear to think that this may exploit the many retinotopic maps in visual areas. And imagery is known to exploit many of those areas that have perceptual representation. So this is, I think, a clear cognitive effect on perception, but I don't think it seriously damages the modularity point of view, because we should draw the borders of perception so as to exclude cases in which we superimpose imagery on perception. I think the right way to view this is that's not really pure perception. It's what you might call quasi-perception, because it includes states that are partially perceptual and partly imagistic. Another reaction somebody might have is that you might want to count those as perception but restrict perception to under 1 second. I prefer the first, but I don't think it's I don't think it really enormously damages the modularity point of view. A more serious problem from the modularity point of view is attention. If you look at these superimposed images on this one here, if you focus your attention on the horizontal yellow and blue stripes, it looks different from if you focus your attention on the black and green. How many get that response? Not everybody. So you can't actually see it as different. How many don't see it as different depending on which you attend to? Interesting. Okay. What about the face and house? Doesn't it look different when you attend to the face and attend to the house? How many think it looks different? Okay, not everybody. Okay. So it's known that attention to different properties changes, makes a change in the brain in the areas that process those properties. So we know that attention to color has an effect on V4. Attention to motion increases activity in V5. If we, let's see, maybe I can skip this. actually, I may be misconstruing this. So this is a case where, I'm sorry, yeah, so this is a case where pictures of faces and houses are tagged with frequencies. The houses are tagged with 1.5 hertz, and the faces are tagged with that is, they oscillate at 1.5 hertz. The faces oscillate at 2 hertz, and you can look in the brain and see what happens when you attend to the face versus the house. And you will notice here that in the fusiform face area, the blue is face, the red is house. You get a much greater activation for attending to the face. That's attending to the face, that's attending to the house. In the parahippocampal place area, you get a much higher activation for attending to the house than the face. And interestingly, you get much smaller, here's V1, the size of the attentional effect for faces and houses is much larger in the fusiform face area and less so in the parahippocampal place area than it is in V1. So you're not increasing your face area by increasing lower level vision. It seems to be a direct effect on intermediate level or high level perception. And so I think that the critics of modularity, like Gary Lupian, are right when they say, as is now well known, attention modulates processing at all levels in the visual hierarchy. So I'm going to skip ahead. However, when you look at the mechanisms of feature-based attention, there's no evidence that they fail to divide into the perceptual and the cognitive. So here is the result, the explanation of attention to motion, to a particular direction of motion. Attention to one direction increases gain in the cells that specialize for that direction, inhibits gain in the cells that specialize for the other direction, and it changes the tuning of the cells toward the attended direction. And it may have a priming component too, as has been alleged in these feature-based attention cases. So far, of course, we don't really know much about the cognitive aspect of it, how you focus your attention cognitively focus your attention on one property rather than another. But so far, our explanations support the perception-cognition distinction rather than being incompatible with it. So I think that fact is very significant as far as whether these results actually challenge the perception-cognition distinction. If the mechanisms divide neatly into the perceptual and the cognitive, then I think that we can reasonably say that it doesn't challenge the distinction. Okay, I've got 5 minutes left. Let me go to one sort of issue that has been alleged to really create serious problems, and that is ambiguous. I think the clearest cases, or the cases that are best candidates for cognitive penetration of perception, are those which involve ambiguous images. I think when you have an image that a picture that's ambiguous, and I think there's more room for cognitive effects. But it's not clear that they really challenge anything, because maybe it's a tension. So the famous duck-rabbit, now from what I've read, it's not really known quite how this works, but a lot of people think it's a matter of where you're attending to this part here versus this part here. There are some other cases that have been used to argue. These are cases where there's an ambiguous stimulus, where people say that once you see it, you can't unsee it. I'm going to give you an example here. How many have seen this? Okay. I hate to ruin it for you. Let's stare at it for a while. How many who haven't seen it before? see what the ambiguity is? Okay, so I'm going to tell you, if you don't want, well, you're going to find out whether you want to or not. Okay, so here it is. Do you see this shape? Think of it as a cigar. And as this thing that looked like a pebble is actually the ash on the end of the cigar. So people say, once you see this, you can't unsee it. That is not, I mean, I don't know anybody who's studied this, but that's not my experience. I find that if you stare at this thing for a minute or so, especially if you stare at this pebble, it simply goes back and forth like the duck rabbit. So I think this is just an ambiguous picture. It's different from the duck rabbit, and it's really hard to see the cigar. And once you see it, you do tend to lock onto it. But this awaits further study. I think there is maybe some cognitive effect here, but I don't know any reason to think it isn't feature-based attention. Here's a more familiar one, the famous, well, how many know what this is? Okay, this is the famous Dalmatian dog. That helps you seeing it, right? It's not a very good. Now, the one thing about, what was so funny? I didn't get what was, okay, I don't know. So here's the thing. There's a substantial bottom-up component in this. I can only find one experimental article on this phenomenon. If anybody knows of any others, I'd be curious to know. But so what you see is on the left and the right, you see two images that, at least to me, look pretty similar. But the guy who did this experiment, Van Tonder and Ajima, what they did was, the person, I don't know whether it was a male or female, they showed that if you rotate one of those, and I don't remember which one, has rotated pixels in the body of the dog, and they found a 40% difference in the ease of seeing the dog with those rotated pixels, so suggesting a substantial bottom-up component to it as well. But, look, if it's feature-based attention, it really just is in the same category as the duck rabbit. I don't see why that is supposed to argue against the perception-cognition joint. Now, I only have 1 minute left. So you know what? In my 1 minute left, I am going to just say something briefly about, look, I'll just do this briefly because I always feel I have to do this. Although maybe less so here than a lot of other places. I think the issue of what perception and cognition are and whether that difference is a joint in nature is obviously an issue in philosophy of mind. I think a philosopher of mind who has no interest in it is brain dead. In the philosophy of language, I think there's links to philosophy of language, or the part of philosophy of language that intersects with philosophy of mind, having to do with conceptualization, for example, what it is and what the non-conceptual is. I think it is relevant to philosophy of philosophy, how conceptual and empirical issues interleave, and I think it's relevant to epistemology because the role of perception in justifying cognition depends on what the difference between perception and cognition actually is. And as I said, I don't think it does epistemology any good to falsify the empirical facts or to falsify the facts about what perception is in order to make it seem easier than it is to justify belief, perceptual belief on the basis of perception. So is there a joint in nature? Yes. Even although that modularity is limited, I think there's still a joint in nature, and that's the end. Let's see, do you want to call on people, or should I?
Whatever you prefer.
Well, what do you guys usually do?
If you want to call on people, that's great. With 2 people in the room with microphones.
Okay. All right. So I'm just going to. Yeah. Yeah.
So about half
halfway through your talk, you had a list of criteria that sort of from the litmus test for when you know you're dealing with perception versus
Yeah.
cognition. And one of them was this all or none
Yeah.
nature of perception. It seems to me that there's a lot of cognitive phenomena that have many of the criteria you listed, but the one I was particularly focusing on was the all or none aspect. So, for
Okay.
example, in understanding language, the meanings of all of the many ambiguous words and all of the many ambiguous syntactic interpretations that you're hearing are missed by you because you,
Yeah.
to understand language, have to settle on one meaning. So
Yeah.
it strikes me that lots of the kinds of ambiguity we deal with, whether it be perceptual or linguistic
Yeah.
conceptual, have this all or none properties. I wasn't sure the basis of putting that on the list, and there were other
Yeah.
things on the list I just
Yeah.
didn't quibble with.
Okay, interesting. So, I'm tempted to say, because I know some of the experimental literature of my psycholinguistics course was in, the 1970s. And I remember in that course, Merrill Garrett showed us these experiments where there were these ambiguities, and there was, one example I happen to remember is the word pot, and he showed evidence that you compute both meanings, but that only one surfaces when you're only aware of one. And my temptation is to say that's perception. I don't know whether, I haven't looked into this, but does that have any plausibility?
Well, I guess I'm interested to hear you come down on that side of it, because that, following the logic of your litmus test, it
Yeah.
seems that there are some phenomena that I think many people would intuitively call cognitive that you would have to
Yeah.
call perception.
Yeah.
It seems like you're happy to
Yeah,
call that perception.
yeah. Well, I'm not happy with it, but that's my. I don't really know what to say, but at least I don't know what to say. The language system really does make a lot of things that happen in the rest of perception and cognition somewhat difficult to fit in. So I'd have to think more about it. Yep.
So I had a related question, which is a more specific version of questioning that came about that rivalry is only specific to perception. So you started off by saying that something looking like a piano is conceptual or cognitive, but not perceptual.
Yeah.
But then if something looking like a piano is cognitive, then presumably looking like a rabbit or a duck is also cognitive, not perceptual. But that illusion then shows that there is a rivalry between these two different versions of interpretation. So how do you reconcile those two different points?
Yeah, so let me say first that I know of no experiments on pianos, on pictures of pianos, but I'm just guessing that artifacts, by and large, are not represented in the visual system, but I don't think anybody really knows how plastic the visual system is. When you pick something that's more related to our evolutionary history, like faces or numerosity, you get more plausibility. Now, in the case of animals, at least for the distinction between animal and non-animal, we know that those are computed very quickly in the visual system. There are these famous experiments by Thorpe and others that show that people can saccade to a picture that has an animal as compared with a non-animal, one side or the other, in maybe 120 milliseconds. So animal versus non-animal, but anyway, in any case, attention can be feature-based attention. When you attend to the duck or the rabbit, that doesn't mean you require a visual property. Attending to something like, attending to Waldo, for example. Maybe you attend to Waldo it doesn't mean Waldo is represented in your visual system. You attend to Waldo by looking for certain characteristic low-level properties or certain characteristic visual properties. So that's really my main response. Yep.
I want to take a step back and ask, what's at stake if we were to, I guess, be quite radical and abandon the distinction between perception and cognition, and rather, because you already have low-level perception and high-level perception,
Yeah.
and rather think about these issues, because I agree there's something that seems different about thinking about fat men on trolleys and whether it's blue.
Yeah.
But think of them more as a continuum and use your list of properties and criteria and just sort of associate different facts with different
Yeah.
phenomena
Yeah.
and say these are ways that our mind varies across different tasks.
Yeah.
Maybe you could argue against taking that view.
Yeah, so I think that the difference between perception and cognition is explanatorily significant, and that it is in the background of our thinking about perception and cognition that there is a joint there, and I think we would go wrong. I think it would be like a physicist deciding that there was, no joint in nature between, solids and liquids, or liquids and gases, or, these joints in nature that you are aware of may not play an immediate role in your day-to-day existence, but your thinking will go wrong if you don't know about an explanatorily significant difference in the areas that you're studying. I mean, I can't point to, like, you'll fall in a manhole in a particular way, but I think that your thinking won't be as good as it could be if you'll make mistakes if you don't know what the divides are. Yep.
So you've given the distinction between perception and cognition, and I'm wondering if between those two classes of minded properties, you exhaust all of what there is in the mind, or?
Oh, no. I'm sorry.
So
I should have said
what
that.
sort of,
Yeah.
other categories are missing from this picture? So
Emotion?
that fall under
Emotion, for example?
emotion, that doesn't count as perception.
Well, maybe there's perception of there is perception of emotion, but that's different from emotion. So no, I'm sorry. I should have said at the beginning that what I'm really most interested in comparing is perception and perceptual judgment. So those are very similar. Oh, I'm sorry. The philosophers have to go. Yeah. Sorry about the overlap. Say hello to Jessica Moss, my colleague. Yeah?
One really quick thing, and then one thing I was more interested in. First, just to kind of quibble along the first two lines with the focus test. It seems like pop-out conceptually you get, like if one of your slides had been about before you even started talking.
Yeah.
It popped out.
Yeah.
And so, more interestingly though, the can't unsee it phenomenon.
Yeah.
I had with a more robust
Wait a minute. Could you speak louder? I'm not
sorry.
hearing. Yeah.
I had what stuck out to me as an example of that can't unsee it phenomenon.
Yeah.
Was in a painting where a certain part of it was radically anamorphic and had a different viewing angle and looked like it was just a smudge until you appreciated it from that other viewing angle and saw that it was.
Yeah.
And so, and now every time I look at the painting, I see what it was supposed to be.
Yeah.
And I was thinking you could call that kind of feature-based attention, but
Yeah.
if so, then it's heavily mediated by that cognitive moment where I
Yeah.
decided what it was.
Yeah, good example. So for those who don't know what anamorphic art is, there's actually one in MoMA that's really a very cool thing. It's when you look at the thing from the right angle. So the one in MoMA is on a long corridor, and if you look at it from the side, you'll see like a picture of something that's intelligible. But if you look at it from straight on, it just looks like something weird, stretched thing that you have no idea what it is. And I've experienced the same phenomenon as you. I would categorize that as an ambiguous image, an ambiguous painting, where feature-based attention can pick out one interpretation. On these phenomena, like the Dalmatian, the cigar. I haven't done a literature search on anamorphic perception. There's a dearth of literature. It's very hard to find anything that really, I have not had a lot of luck finding empirical articles on how this works, although it is appealed to by opponents of a joint, like Gary Lupian, in arguing that perception is just completely saturated with conception and knowledge. But as far as actual empirical studies on this. I don't know. So I guess my inclination is to stick with the feature-based attention until I hear something that actually provides some more information that looks like it points in another direction.
The lab I did my PhD in actually did studies on perception of anamorphic
Oh, yeah?
style
Oh, cool.
stimuli, so I can provide you some references.
Oh, and what's the upshot?
What's the upshot?
Yeah.
I'm not sure what the upshot is in the current discussion, but I mean, the reasons that the distortions occur and the reasons that the right viewing angle creates an undistorted percept are pretty well understood just based on view geometry, the basics of how the visual system.
Okay. But is this work going to illuminate us at all about how, even when you're looking at it from the wrong angle, you can suddenly sort of see it as? Uh-huh. Okay, well, I'd be very interested to read more about it. Yeah?
I would say, do you use the models like as just covering that, as just covering sort of the basic features? Do you see it as kind of near absolute, or do you see, or do you think like crossover that like things like in synesthesia, like or similar things could happen to a low level degree, like how much your red gets over fatigued might change based on your mood or something like that. A lot of subtle things. It's just the basic system doesn't have information feedback between the two processes. Or do you think it's like, or do you think it almost never changes?
What's the it that doesn't change or might not change?
Do you think it's more that the joint?
Or the joint doesn't change?
Yeah, that it's more that the two systems on the side of the joint are two systems, or do you think in a more absolute sense they don't have almost any data feedback between each other?
Oh, no, I'm not saying that they don't have any. No, there's plenty of interchange between cognition and perception. Certainly perceptual judgment is always based on perception. And there's, feature-based attention, there's this, imagery stuff, there are plenty of interactions between cognition and perception, so I'm not denying that. And I think there may be some borderline cases. I don't know whether you get adaptation in synesthesia. If you don't get adaptation in synesthesia, I'd be going to be very skeptical about just how perceptual it is. You get adaptation in mental imagery, and this is well known. In fact, it was discovered by somebody having, this isn't about dreams, but Ron Fink, who was a perceptual psychologist, was having a dream about his prism adaptation goggles, and then woke up and found that he'd adapted to as if he had prisms on. Yeah.
So I usually think of the Stroop effect when I think about this, some conflicts between perception and cognition. Do you comment on that? Do you look at that as two perceptual phenomena that are clashing, or?
Yeah. So Stroop effect, you see color words that are written in various different colors, and you can't inhibit you're asked to name the color, and you can't inhibit the word you're reading, or you have trouble inhibiting the word you're reading. You're slower and less accurate if the names don't correspond to the colors. Well, again, we have language, but I think it's two different perceptual systems. I guess, yeah. Let's see, yeah.
So I'm interested in the idea that babies don't have a color concept because, as in Chalmers' data, they don't form rules over that regularity, or they don't individuate things on the basis of color.
Yeah.
I think that's an interesting way to call it. Could you also argue that those data come from colors being just like everything else, but they're pretty low ranking in your grab bag of things you're going to try to explain things with?
Yeah.
And so maybe you could push babies to use that, but it's not their first guess.
Yeah, well, it's not their second guess or third guess or fourth guess either. Look, The methodology here is look for the use of colors in cognition in babies, between 6 months and a year. And, I've scoured the literature. I have my developmental psychology informants. And, nobody has shown me a single result in which you get babies younger than 12 months using color in any kind of thing that even remotely seems like cognition. So, it's not a definitive thing. Somebody could always, find one, or maybe there's one in the literature that I don't know about, but it's pretty impressive when they use shape, kind, size, and other properties, and they're just not using color.
Well, it is, just to set up intuitions about this a little bit, it is easy to find cases where babies will not pay attention to something under
Yeah.
various circumstances. But it's
Yeah.
still a remarkable coherence, right?
Yeah, the thing is, the novelty preference stuff does suggest a certain kind of attention. That's what's so odd. My initial theory was, well, maybe they just don't attend to colors. They're like highlights. But actually, the novelty preference stuff suggests they do pay attention to it. So it's a bit, I don't know, from what I've been able to find out, it's a bit of a mystery.
So I think we have time for one more question.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering where you place perceptual expertise effects within this, because it seems like you could treat that as just a training of attention, but you can also imagine that you're creating a new class of percepts.
Yeah. Well, there's no doubt that, at least in perception of language, that we train up discrimination. My inclination is to think that there are large cognitive effects on perceptual learning. Most of the cases when I've looked at a bunch of cases, so most of them seem to be cases of exposure. It's not clear that there's any real cognitive component, but there is in the Behavioral and Brain Science article by Firestone and Scholl, there is one response of someone who gives what looks like a real cognitive effect on perceptual learning. So my way of dealing with that, which is in my response to Firestone and Scholl, is that what you should do is you should look for the synchronic joint. So I think there may be a synchronic joint, but not a diachronic joint. And this is something that Fodor and Polishin also said, that maybe there is a diachronic, over time, penetration of perception by, or at least something, something by cognition that has something to do with perception. But that if we focus on the synchronic perception, that we can find a better joint.